Hey, and welcome back to another video. So I'm really excited to announce another free course. I just keep spoiling y'all, do you know what I mean? And if you have ever wondered how to work with core data in SwiftUI, don't worry, I've actually got you covered. So in this video, we're going to be looking at how you can actually build this app. I hope I'm putting it the right way, that you can see on the screen. And this is just a app which shows you somewhere special where you can keep all of your ride or dies. Now this app will allow us to perform CRUD operations such as create, read, update, and delete like you can in a contacts book. We'll also look at how we can actually sort and filter data that we've actually persisted in core data and show that onto our UI. And by the end of this free course, you should have an understanding of what is core data, modeling your data, and how to work with core data and implement it within your SwiftUI apps. Now, we'll also be looking at testing a bit in our core data model as well also. And I've got a really, really great, I'm really excited that I can actually do this. But basically, if you really wanted to as well, you can actually download this app from the App Store, from the description box, or with the QR code that you can see on the screen here, so you can actually demo it out to see if this is something that you're interested in building. So let's actually jump into this video and look at how we can store our ride or dies in this tutorial. So let's check it out. Now, before we just dive straight into the code, you may be thinking, core who? Who? And the word core data, it makes you think,
oh, brother, this guy stinks!
But just hold on. I'm actually here to show you the light because not everything is bad once you understand what's going on. So core data is old, right? Like it's been around for a while and it was actually released in 2003. Now you may be thinking that this is a database. Well, technically core data isn't. And core data is actually a data persistence model for your objects. So you're probably looking at me like,
Huh?
well, core data lets you choose how you want to persist your data. So in our case, when we create new objects, it's not like a database where the data is saved to a database. Instead, it's actually stored in memory and we have to tell it to commit those changes to a file. Now that we've gone over that, what we're going to do now is actually create a brand new project and discuss the steps needed for working with core data. So let's do that now. Okay, sweet. So now we have our Xcode project here. Now what I want to do is I actually want to create a new iOS app. So we go choose next. And then here we can just give our product a name. Now on the App Store, it's called My Best Friends, but here I'm going to call it My Ride or Dies because I don't know what Apple are like with these naming conventions. So let's just do this now. So I'm going to say My Ride or Dies. Now, when you're creating a brand new project, with SwiftUI, you can actually select this option here called Use Core Data. Now, what this will do is we'll actually add core data for you in terms of a entity model, and it will also add some boilerplate code for you to get started with core data. Now because I want to go through this from the very beginning, like top to bottom in terms of everything, we're not going to select this option because we want to do everything from scratch. So make sure that this is unticked and then hit next and then just choose somewhere to save this. So I'm going to choose on the my downloads folder, and then sweet, now we should have our Xcode project like so. Cool. You just create a bit of space here like so. Okay, sweet. So now we have our SwiftUI project open. So if you're someone who didn't choose the option and you're wondering, okay, how can I add core data to an existing project? It's actually quite easy. So you can either go to File, New, File, or hit Command N. And then within here on iOS, you want to search for a file called an XC data model file. So data model. So this is the file that you want. So this data model is where you essentially define the data that's going to be shown, and used within your app. So we'll hit next. And in terms of the name of this, I'm just going to call this contacts data model. Cool. So when you're naming these files, you want to get into the habit of calling it like what it is. So make sure it's plural and then end it off with data model. So you know that it's this data model. That's just how I like to do it as a preference. So now we'll make sure it's part of this target and we'll hit create. Cool. So now when you hit create, you'll be presented with this file. So you might be wondering what this all is. So let's actually break this down. So when you're working with data in core data, basically you're working with things called entities. So if you ever worked with database design before and you've worked with tables like SQL, think of an entity like a table that is used to basically hold your data. Now when you're working with entities, you actually want to give them a name, and in this case, because we're working with contacts in our app, we're going to call our entity contact. Now we're not going to call it contacts with an S where it's plural, because this is a single contact that's going to get saved into our data model. So make sure that when you're creating them, you make sure that your models or entities are singular. So in order to add a new entity, you'll see there's an option here called add entity. And then this will generate a new entity here for you. So what we can do is actually hit enter or double click on this, and we can actually rename this to what it is that we want. So I'm going to call this contact. Okay, cool. So within your core data model as well, you have the attributes, which we'll get onto in a second, relationships, which we won't cover in this video, but I will be covering in an upcoming course, and also fetch properties as well, which I'll also be covering in a upcoming course as well. But what you can do is on the right hand side, you'll see here that you can actually configure, attributes of your entity. So I could actually change the name of it here rather than double clicking on it. And I can also define if it's an abstract entity, parent entity, class name, module. So this code gen basically means like, is it automatically generated for you, or do you want to do it manually? Any constraints that I want to set on it. So I could say that I want to make each contact unique and say it should be constrained by this attribute within our data model, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things you can do here on the right hand side. But what we want to do now is we actually want to look at how we can actually model our data. So when we're working with our contact, there's quite a bit of data that we want to save, relating to a person. So what you can do, like I said before, is you can actually have an attribute. So when you create a brand new attribute, if you just go here and click on the plus, you'll see it'll get created with a question mark for now because it doesn't know what the type is and it doesn't have a name. The default is attribute. But if you look at the drop down, you can see here that these are all the different types that you can actually use when you're working with core data. Now, these are all the default types, but if you had a custom type that you want to work with, you can actually use this called transformable, which will handle transforming that data between the custom data types. Now, we're not going to be working with that in this video, but I may look at it in a future course, but for this video, we're just going to be looking at the default types that we get given to us for free. So let's just add in a few attributes that we'll be working with. So with our contact, there's a few things that I'm just going to add in, and then we'll do that now. So we first of all want to have notes associated with a contact. So because this is going to be a representation of some characters, this should be a string. We also need for our contact as well to have their date of birth. So date. Now this date isn't going to be a string because what you can do when you're working with core data is actually save a date here. So you can actually save an actual date object, which is pretty good. We're also going to need to know as well if it is a favorite, because you could actually favorite people within this app. And then this, again, because we don't need it to be a string, we want it to be yes or no, we can actually mark this as a Boolean. And we also need their name, which can be a string. So this is going to be their full name that we're going to save here as well. We want their phone number. And the reason why we're saving the phone number is because you could have like the plus for different country codes and whatnot. So we're just going to do that as a string for now. And also as well, we want their email. Cool. So as you can see here in core data, if you wanted to, you can actually add validation on this to actually make sure that when someone sets a value on this property, it actually reaches, basically passes their validation. So on email, you could actually add a regular expression here, and this will ensure that it's a valid email. So that's something that you should try out and see, how you get on with that. Okay, cool. So now that we have our entity set up, what I actually want to do now is I want to actually manually manage this entity myself. So by default, Xcode will actually do it for you where it will manage it automatically. But I like to have a bit more control so I can add more properties to it if I need to without having to add another attribute in for no reason. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is actually click on our contact entities here. And then you'll see here on this side where it says class, we want to actually make sure that this time, rather than it saying global namespace, this should be current product module. So this will ensure that when we try to get this entity, it looks for it within our current project module, essentially. And then for the code gen, we don't want this to be class definition. We actually want to change this to be a manual none. So this means that we're going to have to create this ourselves. So because of that, we're now going to create a new Swift file with our own NSManagedObject that matches this definition that we have here. So let's go onto our project and we'll create a new Swift file. I'm just going to say Command N and we'll call this contact. Cool. So in here, we're going to import core data, first of all, because we're going to be using some core data classes. And then we're going to call this final class contact. And then we need this to subclass NSManagedObject. Okay, cool. And just to keep this a bit cleaner, what I'm actually going to do is create a new folder called model. And then we're going to drag this into here. Okay, sweet, cool. So when you're working with core data and you want to manually manage your models, you have to make them an NSManagedObject. So whenever you work with an object in core data, it is a NSManagedObject, which is what we're saying here. This is a type of that. So the next thing we need to do within here is actually match our definition that I said before. Now, just to make this a bit easier, I'm actually going to click on this option here so I can have them side by side. And then I can actually look for my contacts data model. And now I can see all the properties here and their types. So I can just simply copy them over and just, create them. So a few things that you need to note when you're doing this is the first thing, you need to make sure that your property is spelled the exact same as way it's spelled here, even the casing. And the next thing as well is you need to mark them with the @NSManage annotation to let this know that this is a property within your core data model. So this kind of creates the link. So we'll just do one now. So the first one we'll do is for date. So here we'll just say @NSManaged, like so. And then we'll do var and then date. And then we'll create the type. So we'll just say that. So that's what we need to do. So now we're going to create this for every single one.
A few moments later.
So one thing I did realize is that this makes absolutely no sense. So this shouldn't be date. This should actually be date of birth. So we're going to change this to DOB. And I'm also going to change this to DOB as well. So now those two match. So now what we need to do is we actually need to put this in for the rest of our properties. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So now we've done that. So one thing to note here is that when our contact actually loads and we create a new contact in memory, we actually want to give some of these a default value. Now, the first two that I can think of looking at them is we actually want to make our is favorite false by default, and we also want to set the date to the date now. Now this is something that I've realized that if you don't do this, sometimes core data can crash because it's expecting a type and it's nil, and because it's nil it can't save it. So you just want to give it a default value. So that's something to keep in mind when you're working with like dates and bools. In order to do that, what we can do is that there's actually a initializer that comes with an NSManagedObject that allows you to set properties once the object has basically loaded and been created. So if we just search for insert, and the one we want is this one here where it's awake from insert. So this is going to be executed whenever the object is initially created. And then within here, we want to say super.awake from insert. And then after this, what we want to do is we now want to basically say and set this and this. So we can do that by using something called a set primitive. So we'll say set primitive value, and we'll say here that we want the date of birth to be date.now for key. And the key here is the property name in core data. So in our case, this will be DOB. And then we'll do another set primitive value. And then this is going to be false for the key is favorite, like so. Cool. So I'm just going to close this because we don't need this anymore. But you can see that they're all spelled the same and they're all matching. So this is looking all good, which is what we want. So now that we have our model set up with our default values that we have for the properties as well, what we want to do now is we actually need to basically load our core data model file. So if you're working with SwiftUI or UIKit, you have to tell the system that I want you to open up and load this file so we can use this to persist values within it. So we can do that by creating something called a provider. Now in this tutorial, I'll be honest with you, we're going to be using a bit of MVVM, but not everywhere, because when you're working with core data and SwiftUI, a lot of the heavy lifting is actually done for you. So this provider file is what's going to help us actually open up our data model file and start loading data and saving it and whatnot. So let's create a new folder called provider. And then within here, we'll create a new file called ContactsProvider. Now, like I said before, the only purpose of this file is to help us load data and interact with our core data model stack. So let's now import core data, and we'll just define the skeleton of what this will look like. Right, so like I said before, the only purpose of this is to help us actually manage and interact with data in, our actual data stack. So our core contacts data model. So this provider should only have one instance within the entire lifetime of our application, because we don't want to have different instances that interact with different references in memory to our data model, because then we'll get data out of sync. So what we want to do with this class is we actually want to make this a singleton to ensure that there's only one instance of it that interacts with the same data. So let's do that now. So now we're going to move on to loading our core data model. So within our initializer, whenever our object is initialized here, we're going to actually load our file. So you can use that by using the NSPersistentContainer, which allows you to basically access and load this file. So let's just type this out together. So we're going to create a constant first of all. I'm just going to say private let. And its type here is going to be NSPersistentContainer. So within our initializer, we actually need to, like I said before, load it. Now, in order to do that, we want to create an instance of an NSPersistentContainer. So we're going to say persistent container is equal to NSPersistentContainer. And you'll see here that you actually have an initializer where you can basically pass in a name. So the name here is the file that you want to load. So we'll hit enter, and then the name's going to match the exact same spelling here. So if you have to, just copy and paste the name. Like so. So it's super important that it's spelled the exact same, especially the casing as well. So after this, the next thing we're going to do is actually set some settings on our container. So we're going to say persistent container dot view context dot automatically merge the change for parents is equal to true. So you might be wondering, what does this mean? And what this essentially means is that whenever a change happens within our context, which we'll get onto in a second, it will automatically get saved within our data models file. So any changes that we make and say commit this change get persisted. Now the next thing we need to do after this is actually call our load, like so. So this will actually start the process of actually loading our core data file. So in here, we're just going to do underscore, and then we're going to say error. And then if this was to fail for whatever reason, so we're going to say if let error, and unwrap that with a new Swift 5.8 syntax updates, which are pretty nice. I'm not even gonna lie. So what we can say in here is we can actually say fatal error, and then just say unable to load store with error, like so. So now this will basically just crash our app. So this will allow us to see what the actual issue is. Cool. So we've done a few things here. So the first thing we've done is we created a container with our file name. We've then set a setting on it to say that whenever a change happens within our context, we want to automatically merge them together. And we're also saying here as well that we want to load and actually open up our store. So this is all good. Now I said before, that we're going to be working with context. Now this is the time where we're going to explain what they are. So the best way to think about a view context or a context in general is that it's kind of like a bag. So you could have, 3 different shopping bags with each their own individual items. But what you can do at the end, if you wanted to, is you can actually combine all 3 bags together to get one big IKEA bag, for example. So that's all context is. Think about a context as a bag of memory that holds an object with its own state at that moment in time. And you can have different contexts with the same object that have different states. And then if you wanted to, you can then combine the context into the main context so it reflects that state. So that's what it is. Now when you're working with core data, you have to actually provide your context to your view so it can actually save those changes, like I said before, because you're basically giving it a bag to manipulate data. And then when you're happy with those changes, if you want to save it, you can commit it. So let's create a computed property in here called viewContext. And its type here is going to be NSManagedObjectContext. And in this computed property is simply just going to expose our persistent container.view context, like so. So this just allows us to get more safety, where we basically can ask for the view context within a view, or which we'll get onto in later on in this part of the video, when we want to ask for a brand new context that's away from the main one. And we'll talk about why it is you'd want a brand new context away from the main one later on in this video. All right, cool. So now the next thing that we need to do is we actually need to use the code that we just added here and our new view context to basically inject core data into our view. Now, when you're working with SwiftUI, starting with Xcode 14, there's actually a new way of actually injecting a view context into your main application. So before, what you have to do is create an instance of it here and then inject it. But what we can do now is just directly just use it on our root view, which in our case is this content view. So I'm just going to say here, environment. And when you're working with your core data in SwiftUI, you have to essentially inject your view context into the environment. This is so that if you want to, any view can access this view context and do what it is that it wants to do. So we're going to say .ManageObjectContext. And then in here, we're simply just going to say our ContactsProvider.shared.view context like so. So now this submits our bag that we can basically make changes to into our view and any descendants of this parent view. So now we have everything set up. Now, if I was to run this on the simulator, and you can run this now if you want to, nothing is actually going to happen because we're not using, core data anywhere yet. We're just simply just loading it up. So nothing happens. So what we want to do now is we actually want to build our UI. Now, just because I want this video to be purely focusing on core data, the UI I'm going to build it, I'm just going to build it very quickly because I don't want to spend too much time on this. We want to get to the real stuff, which is working with core data. So let's just create our UI now. It's worth noting for this video, I'm actually using iOS 16. So this is going to use some new views that might not be available. Well, they're not available in iOS 15 and below. But also as well, a lot of the source code as well for this course will actually be on GitHub. So you can actually look at this UI because I'm just going to briefly go over it because I just want to get to the core data a bit. But briefly just looking at this, what we just have here is a navigation stack and we just got a list with a for each within it. And it's just simply just displaying names with an icon. And it's also got a button as well, which is being overlaid here as well for us to basically favorite, items in our list. So the whole purpose of this screen is to simply just list out any contacts that we have saved within core data, and we can also manipulate them as well. So that's the whole point of this screen, is to work with those contacts. Looking at this is all right, but what we actually want to do is actually break out our almost like our row into its own component, because in my previous video that you should see on the screen here, working with extracting components, when you're working with SwiftUI and list views, you want to create like a row that you have within a list just to make things a bit more reusable. So what we're going to do is create a brand new file. I'm going to create a brand new file. I'm just going to call this is going to be a new SwiftUI file, a new SwiftUI view. I'm going to call this contact row view. So the whole point of this view is simply for displaying the information that you saw in the rows there. So within our list here, so our whole VStack that we have here, I'm just going to copy all of this. So from the overlay, our VStack, or I should say I'm going to cut this and I'm simply just going to paste that within here. So this is the component for a person, as you can see on the screen. And then within our content view, within our for each, we're just going to say contact row view like so. Cool. So now this looks a lot cleaner and we've extracted out that component. So this looks a lot better. Sweet. So the next screen that we need is that when you actually tap on a contact, I want to display more information about this contact. So let's actually create a contact detail view. Okay, cool. So now you can see that we've got a list here with 2 sections with information within them. And if you want to learn more about sections as well, I actually do have a video on my channel. Honestly, I feel like I have a video for everything, but I do have a video for this on my channel if you want to go check it out. Now, we do set a navigation title here on our list section, as you can see on the screen here, but you won't see it. The reason why you won't see it is because our view in our SwiftUI preview at the bottom here is not wrapped in a navigation stack. So in order to see that, we want to say navigation stack. And then we just want to put our contact detail view within here like so. And then now you should see the name here, which will be the person's name once we actually get that. So now that we have this on the screen here, we actually want to put in some logic to basically help us push from our list when you tap on it to this detail view. So let's go back into our content view. And I'm just going to use a tiny bit of a hack because I don't like that little chevron that you get in the corner there. I'm not a fan of it. So I'm just going to type this out and then we'll break it down. So we just got a Z stack, and within the Z stack, we've just got a navigation link that's overlaid on top of our contact row. So you don't see this, but it's just an empty view that's basically laid on top of our contact row, so we don't get the chevron. So our destination here is going to be our contact detail view, which will pass in our item later on in this video. But if I actually tap on this now, you'll see that it pushes to that screen, and I can scroll back and push back. So now we have the flow of passing. Well, we'll get to it when we actually pass it onto the next screen, but we have a flow of us pushing to another screen. So we're going to need another screen as well, because in here, this is just dummy, contact data. We don't actually have a way to create an actual contact. So let's create a new screen called Create Contact View. And again, we just got a list with sections within it here. So we've got our general section with some text fields and date pickers and toggles, because we're going to be saving different types of data to core data. And we've got our section here with our text fields, so we can actually bind that to the notes that we want to save as well. And we have a navigation title here and some toolbars. Now you're not going to see these toolbars just yet, because our preview again needs to be wrapped in a navigation stack. So we're going to do that. And then now you can see the toolbar items with the cancel and the done as well. Now within them, we also have a dismiss action, which is using the dismiss environment value. So you can dismiss the screen from anywhere if you wanted to. And you guessed it, I do cover that in another video on my channel where we look at navigation, pre iOS 16, which I'll leave a link to as well. So we have all of that. Okay, cool. So now we have our views created. So what we need to do now is that on our content view, we actually don't have a way for someone to tap on a plus button and show our create view so we can actually create a contact. So what we're going to do now is that within our view here on our list, we're actually going to add the toolbar modifier to add a plus button using an SF symbol. I'm not even going to say, I've got a video on it. So SF symbols, and that's going to help us actually show and dismiss the screen. So let's do that now. The first thing we're going to need to do in here is create a state property. I'm just going to make this a tiny bit smaller. So we're going to have a state property here. State. I'm going to call that, we're going to call this is showing new contact. And then by default, this is going to be set to false. So this is going to be the state that our view is going to listen to in terms of presenting our view in a sheet, and also toggling the value when it's tapped on the toolbar. So after our list, we want to add a toolbar in. So let's do that now. And now you should see the toolbar in the top right hand corner. And the reason why is because we use a primary action, which lets the view know that this is the primary action that can happen on the screen. And we also have a button where we toggle the value to either true or false, as well as a image in the label, which is just an SF symbol with the plus. That's what we got there. So after our toolbar, in order to show our screen, we actually need to add in the sheet modifier. So there's two types of sheet modifiers, and the one we want is the is presented with a Boolean. So let's do that now. So with our sheet modifier, we're just binding it to our state property, and within it, we have our navigation stack, so we can get our title and our toolbars within our, create contact view. So if I was to tap on the plus button now, you'll see that it presents it. And because we're using the dismiss environment value on this screen, if I tap on cancel, it dismisses the screen, which is exactly what we want. So everything's looking good so far. Cool. So now that we have, and I know I rushed through that a bit because I just wanted to get to the core data a bit, but like I said, the source code's on GitHub, so you can check out all the UI and see how it's built. But now that we've done that, we're at the stage now where we can actually see how to save data within core data. So this is the exciting part, you know what I mean? Cool. So within our content view, what we actually want to do here is we need to get access to our content provider so we can access the context and, create our new contact and then handle saving them. So within here, we're just going to say var, and then we're just going to say provider. And then within here, we're just going to say ContactsProvider.shared. So this will give us our instance at the top of our file so we can work with that. So we're going to also need some kind of like bridge between helping us actually create a new contact or edit a new contact and help us commit that to Coordinator. So I'm going to create a new file called edit contact view model, and this is going to be the view model for the create screen because we need a view model to manage the data for that screen and then decide what we want to do with it, and then we'll break it down. So just to make things a bit cleaner, I'm going to create a new group called create. So all the create stuff is literally going to go inside of this folder. And I'm just going to drag this view within this folder here. And then I'm going to create a new file, Swift file called edit contact view model. Cool. And then let's just write the skeleton in here as well. Okay, cool. So now we have that in place. So like I said before, the whole point of this file is to help us manage the data that we're editing on the screen. And you might be wondering, why am I saying that? Well, remember what I said before at the start when we were talking about Coordinator about the bags for context. If you actually pass an object from the same view context to another screen and start modifying it, you're actually changing that object in memory. Now, because we're creating a brand new contact and we're also going to be editing contacts as well, we want to edit our changes away from the main view context. So we essentially need a brand new context where we can do whatever we want, and then we can decide whether we want to commit those changes back to the parent or discard them because we don't need them anymore. So this view model that we're working with now is going to essentially be the link that helps us create a brand new context where we can make changes to an object without affecting our main view context. Like I was saying with the bag, you kind of have a separate bag where you can throw away what you don't need, or you can combine that bag with your original main bag. So you now get everything all together. Cool. So now within this file, we actually want to create a publish property for a contact so we can actually listen to the changes that we make to that contact. So we're going to say here, at published var contact. Cool. So this is the contact that our create screen is going to bind to, and we're also going to make changes to as well. And if you notice as well, this is the object that we actually created before, when we manually create our model from our Coordinator entity. Now we've got this error, which is fine. We're going to resolve this in a second. But the next thing we need to do now is actually insert a context into this view model. Like I said before, we create a context that is away from the main screen on our contacts list view. So this is an independent context. So let's create a constant here. I'm going to say private let context is equal to NSManagedObjectContext. Cool. And because we're using NSManagedObject, we need to import Coordinator here at the top of the file as well. Sweet. So now what we need to do here is we actually need to create a initializer to allow us to create a context and also get our provider, and we can choose whether we want to use an existing contact in memory within Coordinator that we want to update on a new context, or we can create a brand new contact on a new context as well and choose where we want to save and commit it to Coordinator or discard of it because we don't need it anymore. So we're going to say init, and then this is going to be provider, and then the type here is going to be contact provider, and then we're going to have contact like so. I'm actually going to make this contact optional and set a default value of it to nil. So this means that whenever this is nil, we'll write some logic to actually essentially just create a brand new contact from scratch. So you're probably sick and tired of hearing me say the word context, but this is now where we need to go into our contact provider, and we're going to need to have a brand new computed property called newContext. And this is going to be a NSManagedObjectContext like so. And this is going to be a persistent container. And this time we're going to say a new background context. So this now is not using the same view context as here. It's completely isolated away, which is what we want. So if we go back into our edit view model, in here, we're going to set our context to that new compute property we just created. So we're going to say self.context is equal to provider.newContext. context like so. And then after here, for now, what we're going to do, and now in here, what we're going to do is actually create a brand new contact within and for our published property. So we're going to say self.contact is equal to contact. And we're going to use the initializer with the context. And in here, we're going to pass in self.context. Now, it's really important that you use the self.context because we don't want to create a brand new context every single time. We just want to use the new one we've created just for this view model. So make sure you pass in self.context. So like I said before, when you create an object in memory in Coordinator, you've not actually saved it. It just exists in memory. So we actually need to say a way to, basically commit those changes. It's kind of like when you go to a shop, you can put everything in your shopping basket, but until you actually pay for it, you don't own those items. And if you, walked out of the shop with those items, then you're a thief. So we need to create a brand new function within here to help us actually save and persist our changes. So let's create a new function called save. And this is going to throw an error, so it's going to be throws. So within this save function, this is where we're going to write the logic to help us persist our changes to our existing, context that we're working with within this file. Now, the reason why we're also making it throws as well is because it's actually possible for Coordinator to fail for whatever reason. And if it does fail, then we'll just display the error to the user just to let them know that, hey, this is the reason why it failed, and they can contact us and we'll fix it because we're developers. So when you're working with committing changes in Coordinator, you actually want to see if the context has changes, because there's no point of you actually saving an object to a context if nothing's changed. So if I said if context dot has changes, I can see if there have been any uncommitted changes that have happened within the context that we're working in. And if there has, so if this returns true, then what I want to do is say try context.save like so. Cool. And this will actually help us save our changes to our, core data. And now when we close the app and reopen it, we should see the items that we persisted. So this is a little change, but this little wrapper here with the has changes helps us make sure that we don't make unnecessary commits, and it just makes our app a bit more performant when it only saves stuff that it needs to. So we want to use this view model within our create screen. So let's go into our create contact view, and underneath our environment here, we're actually going to use an observed object. We're not going to use a state object. Now, the reason why is because when we're creating a brand new contact, we don't want to have a single instance that's used, between every single presentation. We just want to have a brand new clean slate every single time, because we want to have a clean slate with the data that we provide it. So for that reason, we're going to use an observed object. And if you want to learn more about observed object, you guessed it, I've got a video. So we're going to say observed object, and then we're going to say var. And then we're going to say VM, which is just for view model, a shorthand. And then we're going to say edit contact view model like so. Cool. So now we should have an error in our preview, which is fine. And we'll just fix that. So we'll just say fix. And then within here, we'll just say dot init. And then the provider that we're going to pass in here for now is going to be shared. Now we're going to get on to working with previews as well with Coordinator, but for now, just leave it as shared. So we're going to make a few more updates in a few more places. So the first we need to do is that in our done here, when someone taps on done, this is where we actually want to save a contact. So right now it just dismisses. We don't actually just want to dismiss it and that's it. So we're going to use a do catch here. So we're going to say do and then catch. And then within the catch, for now, we'll just print the error. But within the do, we're going to say dismiss. And because we created that save function on our view model, we can now say try view model dot save, and this will save the person. Cool. So now we have our save functionality here. Now the next thing we need to do as well is that within our view model, if you remember, we also created a published property for contact. So we actually need to bind our changes to that contact property within this view. So rather than us having these constants that we have here, instead, what we want to do is actually call our view model and actually basically bind it to the properties within our contact. So for our name, we're going to say vm.contact.name like so. And then for our email, we're going to say the same thing, contact.email. And then we're going to do this for our phone number. And you get the general gist here. So I'm going to speed this up. So as you can see here, basically all the properties that we have within our core data model are now being bound to the UI. So whenever a change happens on any of these properties, it will now get updated within our edit contact view model. And then when someone taps on done, it will then persist that into core data. Now on our content view, we also need to fix this error because this is now expecting the view model and a provider. So we've got to say here, view model, and we're just going to say dot init. And the provider we're going to pass in here is going to be our provider that we define at the top here. So this is going to be provider. Cool. So let's just build this. And you should see that it's all good. Cool. So just so we can actually create a few people. Now you're not going to see anyone just yet. But what we're going to do is actually just create a person. So when we move on to the next section and we actually fetch our data, you'll see them appear on the screen. So I'm just going to run this on the simulator. Now I'm just going to make this a bit bigger. And if I hit plus on here, if I hit plus, it will now present our screen. And now I can actually enter some information in here. I'm just going to say tons. Now it's worth noting that I've not done any validation on any of these fields just yet. We will do some basic validation later, but this video is mainly going to focus on CRUD operations. So I'm just going to say tons at Gmail. I'm going to give you all my real phone number. Psych. Right. So put a birthday in here. Say some random date like this. Okay, cool. Yeah, say favorite. I'm just putting some random notes for now and then hit done and it dismisses. Cool. So now obviously because we're still showing our dummy data, it's not going to show anything. But what we're going to do now is actually look at how we can actually fetch data from core data and display that onto the screen so you don't just see this. So I'm just going to create a bit more space by just dismissing this to make it a bit smaller. Like so. So when you actually want to fetch data from core data, essentially you have to work with an NSFetchedRequest. Now an NSFetchedRequest essentially is basically a command or it's almost like a statement to say that, you know, for this condition, try and get me this type of data. So on our contact, what we're going to do is actually create an extension on our contact, and we're going to hold all of our fetch requests for our model within this extension. So this is just a little habit that I like to do back from my UI kit days, where I like to group all my fetch requests and associate them with my models. So we're going to go into our contact, and then we're going to create an extension on this. Okay, cool. And then within here, we're going to define our fetch request. So I'm just going to type this out and we'll break it down. This is an NSFetchedRequest, and in order to actually fetch data from your entities, you have to use the NSFetchedRequest here and then define the type of your entity. So in our case, this is a contact. And then the NSFetchedRequest here will have the entity and a string representation of your entity's name. So this must be spelled the exact same as your entity in your data model. Now, right now, this would actually help us fetch all of our data that, that we've got within our contacts. But what I want to do is actually sort that data as well. So I don't just want to just get all of our contacts and that's it. I want to sort them by their name. Now, the reason why I've marked this as private and a static var is because I don't want to have to repeat this every single time. I just want to use like the dot notation to easily access this fetch request to get all the contacts if I need to. So we're going to create a new function here called all, which will help us get all of our contacts and sort them as well. So as you can see here, we have our fetch request where we're using our contact fetch request that gets all of our contacts. But this time, in order to sort them, we're actually using our sort descriptors on our NSFetchedRequest. So on here, you basically pass it an array of sort descriptors, and this allows you to define what you want to sort your data by. So in our case, we're saying that we want to use the key path with this, / contact.name ascending true. So we're saying that we want to sort this by their name in ascending order, and then we return this request. So now we have this set up in terms of helping us actually fetch our data. Now, like I said before, when you're working with SwiftUI and CoreData, a lot of the heavy lifting is actually done for you already with property wrappers. Now, in my opinion, you don't need to create a new view model every time to add extra logic to query CoreData. You can just use the property wrappers that are built in and available to us. So if we actually just look at the Apple documentation, we have a property wrapper available to us in SwiftUI called @FetchRequest, and you can actually just pass in a NSFetchedRequest to this property wrapper, and it will essentially just execute it for you. So like I said before, the heavy lifting is done for us, so why would we add in extra boilerplate code that we just, we don't need? So let's look at how we can actually use this on our content view to get our data. So let's go into our content view, and at the top here, we're going to use the property wrapper, the fetch request property wrapper. So I'm just going to create a bit more space here, and then underneath our state property here, we're going to say @fetch request, and then open this up, and you'll see here that you actually have quite a few different options. Now, the one that we want is the option where you can pass in a fetch request like so. So we want this one, and then what we're going to pass in here is our contact.all to get all of our contacts sorted for us. Cool. So when we define this property wrapper, we need to also create a variable to hold that data so that our lists can listen to those changes. So this is one of the benefits of using this in SwiftUI, is that if there's ever a change to your data model with an entity, it will automatically update and refresh for you. So you don't need to do anything. Like I say, the heavy lifting is done for you. So I'm going to say var contacts like so, and then we've got that set in place. So in one line, we've got our code to bind it to our list and help us fetch this data. It's amazing, right? So what we want to do is replace our for each and the data that we're passing through with our, contact data from CoreData. Rather than having this range here, instead, what we're going to do is delete this, and we're going to replace this with our contacts like so. Cool. So we will get an error here, and that's because our model is not identifiable, and we actually don't have an ID on it right now. Now, in order to make this identifiable, there's two ways you can do this. You could either do this where you say ID, and then you could say /.object_ID, and this will use the NSManagedObjectContext as the unique identifier on our object. Or alternatively, what you could do is, rather than doing that, you can just go onto your contact and instead just mark this with the identifiable protocol like so. Cool. Now, I personally prefer option 2 because it's less code and you just put the protocol type on the model. Sweet. So now we've done that with our contact, I'm just going to rename this property here to contact and make it singular. And we now need to pass this data through to our row and also as well to our contact detail screen. But let's first of all just tackle our row first. So in our row here, we want to create a constant. I'm just going to call this contact. And then now we can use our properties that we defined on our model within this view. Now this is going to complain saying that we're missing the parameter contact, and we're going to resolve all these issues, like I said before, when we get to working with previews in CoreData. But for now, we're just going to comment this out and we'll come back to this later. But in our text here, we're just going to say contact.name. And then we're going to say contact.email. And then we're also going to say contact.phone number. Cool. So in the preview at the start of the app, or if you've downloaded the app onto your device, you can see that you actually get like a little balloon next to someone's name, and that indicates that it's someone's birthday. Now, it's possible to do this quite easily with our model, because all we just need to do is just simply add a computer property to this model. And this is one of the reasons as to why I personally like managing these myself, because I can now create a property that doesn't have any relation with CoreData, and it just calculates some data based on a value of our attributes. So in here, we're going to create a computer property called isBirthday. And this is going to be a bool. And we're just going to do a comparison on the dates. So we're going to say calendar.current.isDate in today. And then we can just simply just pass in our DOB. And if our date of birth is within today's date, then that means that is our birthday. So we're not comparing time, we're actually comparing dates. So this is like a nice little handy function on the calendar API. Now we can use this within our view. So we just go back. What we want to do here is, depending on whether it's our birthday or not, we want to show the balloon emoji. So let's do that now. So we're just going to say here, put a space, and we're going to say some string interpolation. So we're just going to cut this and then put that in here like so. Cool. And then before here, we're going to do some more string interpolation. We're simply going to say contact.isBirthday like so. And if it is their birthday, then we're just going to show the balloon emoji. So, and if it isn't their birthday, then we're just going to show an empty string, so you won't see anything there. Cool, sweet. So now what we want to do is back on our content view. So let's go back to our content view. We should have a build error here. And we need to pass in this here, this contact. So we're going to pass in this contact like so. Cool. Okay, cool. So now the final thing that I want to do is I actually want to show you how we can actually modify our contact, because it's possible, as you can see here, to essentially favorite and unfavorite a contact, because you can decide who is your ride or die or not. And within our role, you'll see here, this is like an isolated component away from our, content view. Like this is a child view. So how will we access our manage object context within this context here to actually handle favoriting our person? So if we really wanted to, we could do a few things to actually get around this problem. The first thing we could do is we could actually create a brand new view model just for this view. Now, in my opinion, I feel like that's a bit overkill. And the reason why is because we don't really have a lot of properties in here that we need to observe, which is the first thing. Also as well, we don't need to preload any data like we will before, where we can have our create and update. And we also don't need to verify as well if an item already exists in CoreData. So creating a view model just for this view is a bit OTT. Now, what we can do instead is actually use an environment value to actually access our context and modify that, which is what we want. Because if you're looking at this row on the home screen, if we just open up the simulator a bit more, this screen is working with the main view context. So any changes that we make on this screen, we actually want them to be automatically committed to our view context. So it makes sense just to access the main view context within this view here and make our changes. Now we can do that using an environment value within this view, which is pretty cool. At the top of our view here, we want to create an @environment, and then we're going to say, get me the manage object context like so. And then we're just going to say private var. I'm just going to call this mock for manage object context. Cool. Now, another thing we need to do as well is that if you actually make a change to, if you actually make a change to our contact, so if you actually toggle our contact on and off, we actually want our main view to actually redraw and show those changes. Now, in order to do that, we need to change this to be an observed object. So let's do that now. And then this needs to be a var. So now whenever our contact gets changed, our main view will refresh and reflect them. And if you're also wondering as well that how can this just access the manage object context? Well, if you remember, at our root of our application, we actually injected our view context here. So any child view within here now has access to that, which is pretty nice. So this is one of the reasons why, if you kind of follow this pattern, a lot of the things are kind of done for you. It is simple, but it works and it makes sense because you're kind of not fighting against the framework, which is what we don't want to be doing. So let's go back here. And within this view, we actually are going to need a new function for helping us handle toggling favorites on and off. So let's create a brand new function. Now, when I'm creating functions within my views, I like to create a private extension so it's not mixed in with the view, building. So we'll go to a private extension on our contact row view. And we're just going to create a function called toggle fave. Okay, cool. So now within here, the first thing we want to do in this function is we want to say contact.isFavorite, and then we want to toggle the value. So we just want to switch it to the opposite of what it is now. And then after this, we're going to copy what we did before, where we use a do catch and check to see if there are changes on the context. And if there are, commit them. And also to do that, we need to say mock.hasChanges. And if there has been changes, then we're just going to say try mock.save like so. And then in our catch here, we're simply just going to say print error. So just print any errors to the console so we can look at what's gone wrong and handle it from there. So now we need to actually call this when our button is tapped. So on our button here, I'm just going to call that here. So we're just going to say toggle fave. So now this will handle the toggle in favorite. And we now need to give our user some kind of like UI indication that the person is now favorited with a yellow star. And if they're not favorited, it'll just be a gray star. So right now we have our gray, but instead of that, we're going to use a ternary operator to help us change between the color that you see. So in our foreground color here, we're just going to say contact.isFavorite. And if it is, then we're going to show our yellow, or else we'll just show the gray that you see right now. Okay, cool. So now let's just run this and just see what happens. So we'll go back into our content view as well. And you can see here that the person that I created before is now appearing on the screen and they were favorited. And if I actually click into them, it's still showing the dummy data, which is fine. We'll get onto that in a second. But we're now successfully saving their information. So if I was to type on this star here, you can now see that it unfavorites them. And if I was to rerun this, you can now see that when we rerun the app, it actually did persist our changes to that person and they're now not favorited anymore. And if I tap on that again and run it again, you'll see that they're now favorited. Cool. So that works great. So the next thing we need to do is actually pass our data onto our contacts detail view. So in our contact detail view, we just want to create a constant called contact. So let contact. And we're going to do a similar thing to what we did before, where we basically comment out our preview, which is fine. So we'll comment this out. Cool. And we'll come back to that later. And now we just want to basically just populate this with the data that we, can see on the screen here. Essentially where it says like here, we just want to replace that. So we're going to say, so here it's just going to be contact.email. And then it's going to be contact.phone number. And then rather than it being .now, we're just going to have contact.dob. And then for the notes here, it's going to be contact.notes. And then we're just going to copy our logic from before, where we just showed a balloon or not here, depending on whether it's their birthday. So we go into our contact row view here. Cool. So what we could do to actually make this better, to be honest with you, is rather than us repeating ourselves, we actually could move this out into an extension. So rather than having the is birthday here, we'll leave that there. But what we'll do is we'll go into our contact and we'll create a new property called formatted name. Should be of type string. And then this will just return basically that string if we need it. So rather than this being that, we'll just say here, it's birthday and name like so. So now within our view, rather than us having to do this, we can just say contact.formatted name. And then within our contact detail view, we can just say, rather than name here, we can just say contact.formatted name. And then within our contact detail view, we can just say contact.formatted name. And then within our contact detail view, we can just say contact.formatted name. And then within our contact detail view, we can just say contact dot formatted name like so. Cool. So now we can run this and see if it works. So let's just run this and test it out. And it doesn't work because we need to pass it into our contact detail view. So here, contact. Let's run this and see what happens. Okay, sweet. So if we just tap on this here, you'll now see that we see all of the information that I actually set before. Cool. Sweet. Now let's actually just create someone to see if you actually see their birthday. So I'm just going to put in some random information here like so, and we'll leave the date as today's date. And if I hit done, you'll now see the little balloon here. So it does show the balloon to show that it is their birthday. So this is all good. So now when we're actually working with our app, we have it saving and reading, which is really good and what we want. One thing that you probably realize that I have to keep running the app on the simulator to basically test this out. I can't actually use the previews. So what I want to do now is actually look at how we can use, core data with a SwiftUI preview and just use that to test out our app without having to run it on the simulator every single time. Now, when you're working with previews, like I said before, when we were talking about context, you want to create one for your SwiftUI preview so you don't affect your main application. It's just like a playground for you to do whatever you want. Now we're going to make some changes to our provider. So let's just close this and we'll go into our provider. And within here, what we want to do is actually check to see if we're running on a SwiftUI preview. And if we are, we're going to create a completely isolated context where we can just do whatever we want. So I'm just going to check to see if we are running a SwiftUI preview. And this is, I'll be honest, this is something that I nabbed from Stack Overflow, but we're just going to add this in. And what this extension allows us to do is actually check what I just said, like, are we on a preview here? So in order to actually do that, we need to import SwiftUI. And now we should have that. So we're checking the process to see if this key exists and if it's equal to 1, so true. Cool. So we want to make sure that any changes that we make when we are within our previews, we only do that within memory. After we finish creating an instance of our NS persistent container, we want to set a path for it to point to a place in memory for where we make changes to it. So let's do that now. So we're going to say if environment values dot is previews. Within here, we're going to set a path. Now that path is going to be persistent container dot persistent store descriptions dot first dot URL is equal to a URL file init with path, and then we're going to set this to be dev no. So now this will make sure that when we're running it on a preview, and also as well when we get to testing, that we're basically setting this to a path in memory, so it's not something that will actually be persisted. When we're done with it, it'll just get discarded. Now we need a way to create some dummy contacts within our app. So on our model, we want a way on our contacts to create some dummy data. So let's go into our contact. And on our class here, we're going to create an extension to help us make previews. So I'm just going to create another extension here just to basically group this together. And then within here, we're going to have a function called make preview. Now this function is going to be a discardable result. And if you don't know what that means, essentially it means that the value that it returns, you don't need to use it if you don't want to. You can just get rid of it. And you don't need to basically set a property to hold the value. It can just basically just return and nothing will happen to it. And this is going to return an array of contact. Now for this function, there's two things we actually want to pass in here. So the first we want to pass in is the number that we want to make and the context that we want to create these contacts within. So let's create a new property in here called count int, and then we'll say in context, and this will be NSManagedObjectContext. Cool. So within here, we're actually going to loop through the count that someone has passed to us, and we're going to create a contact for each one within that loop. So let's create an array of contacts first. So we'll just say contacts, and it'll be an empty array. And then we'll simply just return it. And then in between these, we're going to have a for loop. So we're going to say for I in 0 ... down contacts or count. Cool. So this is going to start from 0 and actually count its way up to the count that you passed in. Cool. So within here, we want to create them. So we're going to say let contact is equal to this. And for this, we want the context because we want to use the context that's passed in here. And then we're now just going to set the properties on our contact here for our dummy data. So we're just going to say, so I'm just going to type this out and then we'll break it down. So you can see that we set the item and the email using the index to just create some like dummy, data. And for the favorite, we just use a random Boolean. Same with the phone number. We'll just use the index and go from 1 to whatever value. And then we also have a date of birth where the date of birth is based on the date now minus the index that we're currently at. So it'll be, if it was 0, it'll be now. If it was 1, it'll be tomorrow, so on and so forth. And then we just have some dummy data for notes. And then we simply just append that into our array that we're going to return at the end. Cool. Okay, cool. So now we just need a function for getting a single contact if I wanted to. So within here, we're just going to say func, and then we're just going to call this preview. And this is going to return a contact. Now what we want to pass in here is our context. Cool. Now by default, what I'm just going to say here is this is going to be our contacts provider .shared .view context. So if I don't want to pass in a context at all, I'll just use that one as the default. And then within here, we're just going to use our make preview. We'll say one context, and we'll simply just return the first one. So we're just going to say return. And then rather than me using dot first, where I have to like force and wrap it, I'm just going to say 0 using subscripting. So that'll get me the first one. And then the final thing we'll do in here is that we'll just add in some logic for creating an empty contact. So I'm just going to copy this function and just tweak it a tiny bit. So this is going to be called empty. And then this is going to return contact. And then the context here is going to be context. So this will just be an empty contact with no data set on it. Cool. So now we have our data set up for our dummy data for when we're working with our SwiftUI previews. So we want to make all of these functions static as well, because I don't want to have to create an instance of a contact to use any of them. So we're just going to mark them all as static. Cool. So let's just use this on our contact row view, and we're going to uncomment this out and it should complain. Okay, cool. And then now in here, we're going to say dot preview, like so. Cool. And now let's just run our preview and see what happens. Cool. And now you can see that we have an item showing up in our SwiftUI preview using the first item, so 0, to show on our SwiftUI preview. So this is looking good. Now the next one we want to do is our detail that we commented out. So let's go into our content detail view. And then we're going to uncomment this out again. And then this was also going to complain. And we'll just do the exact same thing where we just say dot preview, like so. Cool. And we should see information relating to the first item. Cool. So this is looking really good. Sweet. So the next one I want to do is our new contact. So let's go into our create contact view here. And we'll just scroll down. And we're going to type a bit of code out for this one. So what we're going to say here is we're going to create a preview provider. So we're going to say let preview. I'm just going to say contacts provider dot shared, like so. Cool. And then for our provider here, we're just going to create our preview, like so. And then on our actual view as well, we're actually now going to inject our own context. So we're literally going to override what gets injected at the root. So in here, we're going to say environment, manage object context, and we're going to use the preview that we're defining here. So this is now our new context we're going to be working with. our preview.viewContext. So there's one more view that we need to use this on, and that's our content view, which is our list of data. So if we go into our content view, so what we want to do here is right now, this is empty. So we need to use our make preview function within our SwiftUI preview. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create two previews here. I'm going to create one preview for when our view is actually empty, and we'll handle that next so we can show some information to tell you, hey, it's empty, you might want to create some people. And we'll actually create one where it's preloaded with some people as well. So the first one we're going to do is actually create preloaded people. So let's create our preview like we did before. So we'll say let preview is equal to our provider.shared, like so. And then if you remember, we created a provider here, and because it's a struct, we actually get an automatic initializer. So what I could actually do here is say provider and override that with this preview. So this is the one I want you to use in this scope here. And then now, because we're actually using the environment value within our row here, we actually want to override that with this preview. So we're going to say environment object, well, environment.ManageObject, and then we're going to pass in our preview.viewContext like so. Cool. Now, just so it's clear that this is specifically for displaying contacts with data, we're also going to give this a display name. I'm going to call this contacts with data. Cool. And then finally, we're going to say in our onAppear that we're going to say contacts dot make preview, and I'm just going to say I want to have 10, and this is going to be within our preview dot view context like so. Cool. And now you'll see instantly that you basically get 10 random, 10 random items on the screen here. So this is just like some dummy data that you can now see that's working and reading from your preview core data within here. So this is pretty cool, and we can like play around with this and do whatever we want. Now obviously if I push to the screen and come back, you can see that it also handles the navigation as well. So this is pretty sweet. Cool. So what we want to do now as well is we want to also as well create another preview for when there's no data. So it's just like empty data on the screen, so we can handle that state. So this time we're going to copy the exact same thing here, except our onAppear. I'm just going to paste that below. And we're going to call this contacts with no data. And we're going to need to rename this from preview to empty preview. Cool. So you can see that I'm getting to the habit of making sure that whatever context I'm working with in the preview is completely isolated and they don't know anything about each other. So now if we go to contacts with no data, you'll now see that we don't see any information on the screen. So now we can handle our empty state by just looking at this SwiftUI preview. So now this is all set up and we're all good to go with using this, and we don't really need to run our app on the simulator anymore, which is pretty sweet. So let's look at how we can actually create an empty data screen. So one final thing I just want to do is on this empty data screen, we're just going to type out some information. Again, I'm just going to put in some random information just to see if this saves it and works. Let's choose a random date. And then if we hit done, you'll now see that we see our item here within our SwiftUI preview. So like I said, we can do pretty much everything we want and actually test this all out in SwiftUI, which is really cool. So we want to actually get off this and go back onto it where there's no data. Cool. And what we want to do now is we want to actually handle our empty screen state. So we want to make sure there's some information to tell you that, hey, there's nothing here while you do something. So I'm just going to create a new view called no contact view. Cool. And within this view, what we're going to do here is I'm just going to type out some UI and then we'll break it down. Okay, cool. So it's just simply just two texts on a field with some information about, hey, it's a bit empty in here. Let's create some content with a little emoji saying hit the plus button. Cool. So now let's actually use this within our content view. So it's quite simple. All we need to do. So the first thing we need to do is, rather than us having a list here, we actually want to embed this list within a Z-stack. So I'm just going to create a Z-stack here. And we're just going to copy our list, well, cut our list into our Z-stack. And within here, we're just going to write a condition to say if contacts is empty, simply to show our no contact view. And on our list, we're just going to show our list in the else statement here. So that's pretty much all we need to do. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, this is called no contact, but let's say this is, let's actually rename this and call it no contacts, because it's more than one you could have. And we'll say rename, cool, sweet. So now, if we look at our previews here, we have our data here, where we can see our contacts with our data. And if you click on contacts with no data, you can now see that we don't have any data. So we have our view telling us that we want to create some. If I hit the plus button here and just create a random person and then hit done, you'll now see that that goes away and we see our list. So everything's working perfectly how we want it to. Okay, cool. So when you're working with iOS applications like the Mail app or, you know, any kind of built-in stock app, you normally get actions when you swipe across on an item to either edit or delete it. So what we're going to do now is look at the update in CRUD and also the delete as well using swipe actions. So what I want to do is actually set up some swipe actions on our row. And when you swipe across this, I want to give you the option to edit or delete. And if you want to learn more about swipe actions, then check out the video that I'll put on the screen here so you can learn how to set these up. So on our contact row, we're just going to say dot swipe actions. And I'm just going to make this smaller to get a bit more space. Or actually, I'm going to hide it actually to get a bit more space. And then within here, we're going to create a closure. And on this, we're also going to say allows full swipe, and that's going to be true. So if you fully swipe on the edge of this, it will actually execute the first one, which in our case is going to be delete, because we want to swipe across to delete a person from our list. Now, when you're working with swipe actions, you can actually create buttons within them. So let's do that now. Cool. So we have two buttons here. We have a button with a role destructive, which it means is when you swipe across, it'll just kind of do the deletion animation for us. And we have a SF symbol within a label. So this is the delete with the trash symbol. And we also as well have the edit and the pencil as well. So if you tap on it, edit, and we just set some tints on these buttons. So let's go on to our canvas. And this time, if we just run this, if you swipe across now, you'll see these options here. Now, obviously, when you swipe across and you delete it, it's not actually deleting it from core data. So it's just removing it from the list, and you have to handle the deletion yourself, which is what we're going to look into now. So within our button here, we actually want to call delete and remove this item from core data and persist that as well. Now to test this out, because it's a SwiftUI preview, we want to actually test this out in a simulator where you can actually rerun the app again and see if it's committed those changes. So for this, I'm just going to hide the SwiftUI preview. So the previews, in my opinion, is good for like seeing what data would look like and updating data and whatnot. In terms of actually deleting data, you probably want to test this out in a simulator. So in here, we're going to create on our contact view, on our content view, I should say, in here, we're going to create a new function called delete. And it's going to be underscore contact, cool. Sweet. So this delete function is going to throw because we want to catch any errors for when things have gone wrong. So within here, we need to actually access our context and essentially remove that item and then commit that change. So in order to do that, we're going to say let context is equal to the provider within this view now, view context. Okay, cool. So now what we want to do is we want to check to see if that item actually exists in core data. And if it does exist, then we're going to attempt to actually delete it. So we're going to say let existing contact. And then we're going to say try. And then now on our context, to see if it exists, we have a function called existing object. And this uses the ID of the NSManagedObject. Now, when you're working with core data. You don't want to do comparisons with two different objects because it's possible that it can change. Instead, you want to see if something exists using the ID. So we're going to say with contact.objectID like so. Cool. So if this is all good, it will carry on. And then if this is good, we'll now attempt to delete the item. And then now we'll say context.delete. And then this will be the existing contact. So this is going to get the object and delete the one that we've just retrieved to make sure that it definitely exists. Cool. So now we need to call this function whenever someone taps on delete or does the full swipe within our swipe action. So here, we're just simply going to use a do catch because the function can throw an error. I'm going to say catch, and we'll simply just print the error. And then here we'll say try, and then we'll do delete. And we're just simply going to pass in the contact from our for each here. Cool. So let's actually just test this out and see what happens. So like I said before, we'll run this on the simulator and see what happens. So let's actually just delete dogs, and you'll see that the item goes. But let's actually just run this again and see if it's actually removed it. You'll see that it's not gone away. So we did call delete, but it didn't actually delete it. And this is the point that I was trying to make before. And I think it's really important that you see it in action about core data. So just because we modified the object, we didn't actually commit the save to core data. So after our delete, we need to actually tell the context to save those changes. Now, because we're just deleting the item and we're trying to save it, we don't need this to be a super high priority on like the main thread. We can actually just move this onto a background thread and say, hey, whenever you got time, just remember to commit this save and delete it from core data, which is what we're going to do now. And starting with Xcode 14, Apple actually allows us to use Swift concurrency within core data, which is really nice and cool. So we're actually going to use a task to help us delete this on a background thread. So let's do that now. So we're going to say task, and we're going to set the priority on it. So the priority on this task is going to be background, so it's on the background thread. And then within the operation block, we're simply just going to say await. Within the block, we're simply just going to say try, and then we're going to say await. And then when you're trying to do asynchronous tasks within core data that you want to like kind of carry on later, there's a function called perform that has a closure, and that closure allows you to execute code that you want to asynchronously. So in our case, we want it to perform the save a bit later. So we'll say here context.perform. So we'll say context.perform like so. And then now what we're going to say here is within our context.perform, we're going to say try context.save like so. Cool. So now this will try to save this asynchronously when it has time, which is what we want on a background thread. Cool. So let's actually just try that again and see if it actually this time commits those changes. So we'll run this again, and then now we'll delete dogs, and it's gone. And we'll just run, and this time you can see that it's actually committed it and said, okay, this is now gone. So this works perfectly. So now we have deletion working within our app. And if I wanted to, I could do a full swipe delete here, and it will delete that contact like so. Cool. Now, because we want to move on to the next task, which is actually updating some information, I'm just going to create a brand new object here like so. So now what we want to do is that when you swipe across and you tap on edit, we actually want to show our create screen. And this time we want it to have the title to say update contact, and we want to update that information. So we're going to reuse our edit view model here. What we want to do is we actually need to create some kind of like state property within this view to essentially help us manage like the person that we want to edit. So right now, there's no way with this sheet modifier to pass data into it from outside of this closure. It's just a limitation with SwiftUI. So we're going to need to use the alternative sheet modifier that allows us to basically listen to changes to a property, and then we can access that value. So first of all, we're going to need to delete this, show a new contact, because we don't want that anymore. And then we'll get onto these errors a bit later for this button, but I just want to start our way from the top and then work our way down. So within our edit action here, if someone actually taps on edit, we want to set a state property at the top here for contact to edit to be the contact that we're trying to edit. So we need to create another state property here called contact to edit. And it's going to be of type contact like so. And we'll make it optional because you might not have someone that you want to edit. Cool. So if we just scroll down, within our edit here, so in our button, we're simply just going to say contact to edit is going to be equal to the contact that, we're accessing from our for each. Cool. And we just scroll down a bit more. We now have an issue here where when you were tapping on the plus button here before, we were just toggling, showing our screen based on this being true or false. We don't have that anymore. Now, in order to actually show this screen now with a new empty person, we can actually use that dot empty that we had from before. So now we can simply just say contact to edit is equal to dot empty. So we need to replace this sheet with the alternative where you can actually listen to changes to a state property. So after this toolbar, we're just going to say dot sheet. So we want this option here. Now we actually do want the on dismiss because when the screen dismisses, we actually want to reset our contact to edit back to nil. Now in order to access this, if you just hold down the option key on your keyboard and hit enter, we'll now get all the parameters. So for our item here, this is going to be our contact to edit like so. In our on dismiss, in here, we want to set our contact to edit back to nil, which is what we want. And then within our content, this here is going to be our contact. And then we're simply just going to copy this code here and paste it within here like so for now and delete the sheet because we don't need that no more. Cool. So I don't know if you remember, but on our edit view model, we had a parameter here. We could actually pass in an existing contact. So this is where this is going to come into play. So what we want to do now is if you just go back into your content view in here, we want to use that where we say contact is equal to our contact that we've got from our sheet here. So this is passing through this content here. So now we have the existing contact that someone is trying to edit. Cool. So within our edit view model, we need to write a bit of logic here because we need to basically just change what's going on. So in here, what we're simply going to say in here is that we're going to load this contact with either the existing contact we're passing through our parameter here, or if there's nothing there, we're just going to set that to the empty contact like we're doing here. So let's actually just type this out. So what we're going to say here is that if let contact, and we'll just simply just unwrap that. And if this passes, then we're going to try to see if that object exists within our context. So we're going to say existing contact copy is equal to our try question mark. And then we're going to simply get our context here and see if it has existing objects with our contact dot object ID. Cool. And then we'll just do an else for now. Cool. So we're going to get our contact that we're passing through here and try to unwrap it. If we can unwrap it, the next thing we'll do is try to find to see if that actually exists within CoreData at the moment. Now, if it does exist within CoreData, we actually want to load our contact with the existing contact copy so we can just edit that object in memory. And now, because it is an NSManaged object, we actually need to convert this into a contact. So at the end here, we're going to say as contact like so. Cool. Now, if any of these fail, then that means that it doesn't exist and this is a brand new person. So we're just going to cut this and put that in the else block where we get a brand new person, which is what we want. So I actually want to create a brand new property within this view model to essentially help us. I want to dictate whether this is a new or an existing contact that we're trying to edit so we can display some kind of like, changes on our UI. So within here, we're just going to create a new constant and I'm just going to call this like let. It's going to be a let and it's going to say is new and it's going to be a bool. So when it's an existing contact, we're going to say self.isNew is equal to false because this is us actually getting an existing contact that already exists. And then within here, we're going to say self.isNew is equal to true. So within our create view, we actually want to replace this here with our isNew and use a ternary operator to change the text that you see on the screen. So I'm going to say viewModel.isNew, and this is going to be new contact, or else we'll use update contact. Cool, sweet. So now let's just run this and see what happens. And if I actually tap on this plus button, you'll see that something, although this does show new contact and this is correct, we've actually got a bug. And the bug is that whenever we create a new, well, tap on the plus button, it's actually adding an empty contact onto the screen. So why is it doing this? Well, remember what I said before about editing the main view context. This is what we're doing here. And we're doing this here where if you go into your content view, we actually create an empty contact. And if you click into this function, it's using the view context that our list is listening to. So like I said before, whenever you're making changes for a new person or updating some data, you want to isolate that away from the main view context. So in order to fix this, what we need to say here is context, and then we just want to pass in our provider.newContext to isolate that away. So let's just rerun this. And this time, if we hit plus, and if I dismiss this, you'll see there's no more new empty contacts on the screen. So let's just create a new, I don't know why SwiftUI does this, but sometimes when you display a view, the button gets, I think this is a bug, it disables it. So you have to like kind of scroll up to re-enable it. I'm not sure why. Anyway, so if we create a brand new person, so just put some random stuff in here and hit done, you'll now see that it displays on the screen. If I click edit, it actually pre-fills the information that I filled out before from the core data, which is pretty cool. So now I can just enter some notes in and I can change my name here to Tons. And I can turn off the favorite. I could also change my birthday. And if I hit done, you'll now see that it actually updates our data on the screen. So we're now able to pre-fill a screen to edit that data. And we're also now able to actually make changes to that data and persist that back to core data. And it all works, the magic all works because of this view model, because we're literally loading this view model with the existing data in here and binding that to our view. And then when we call done, it will commit those changes. So this is a nice little pattern you can do with, core data and SwiftUI for updating. So now we've got our create, read, update. So now we have all that done. And this is a nice basic example of how you can get things working with core data. Now, I will say, if you want to take a bit of a breather, because I'm not going to lie to you, I've been sat here for a long time as well. But if you want to go and treat yourself to like a massage, chicken burger, whatever it is you want to do to relax here, I don't blame you. Go and take a little break, right? Because what we're going to do now is we're actually going to look at how we can actually improve our code and actually make it a bit better, as well as look at like stuff like, sorting, filtering, and unit testing as well. So the next thing we're going to do now is looking at how we can improve our contacts provider, because if you actually look at our views, we have our like save logic and our delete logic like kind of scattered about in different places rather than it being in one place. So what we actually should do is actually move those, like, your crates, your reads and whatnot. Anything that manipulates data directly with our core data model, we want to actually put that all in one place, which is our provider. So we're going to look at how we can do that now. So the first thing we're going to do is actually go into our provider. And what we want to do in here is we want to create a function for basically telling us whether the object exists. We want to also create functions for deleting as well. So now let's create a function here for telling us whether our object actually exists. So underneath our init, we're just going to create a function here called exists. And then this is just going to return the contact. Cool. So in terms of what we want to pass in here as a parameter, we want this to be the contact that we want to check to see if it exists first of all. So we're just going to underscore contact like so, contact. And then we also want to pass in a context. Cool. Also as well, we want to make sure that the type here just is optional because you might not have a contact if it don't exist. So what we're going to say here is, I'm just going to type this out and then we'll break it down. So what we're going to say here is we're going to try to use the context that you pass in to find the contact with the ID. And if they exist, then we're simply just going to return that to you. So now we have a function in here for managing whether it exists or not. So now the next one that we want is our delete. So we're going to say function delete. And this is simply just going to throw. And then the parameter here is going to be contact. And then again, we're just going to be passing in the context like so. So I'm hoping you're starting to see a bit of a pattern with these functions here where I'm actually basically passing the context into them because I don't know what context you want to perform this on. So I'm giving you the flexibility to choose where you want to do these, changes on. And then within here, we're going to reuse our exist function. So we're going to say if let existing contact. And then we're going to say if it exists the contact in the context that we get from our delete function, we're going to call our delete code here. So we just need to go into our content view and then the delete function that we have here, all this code here. So from here, from our delete to our task, we just want to copy this and then just paste it like so. And then the final thing that we want is our persist. So we're going to create a function called persist. And then this is going to throw as well. And this is going to persist in the context that you pass in. Cool. So now what we need to do is actually use these within our views. If we go into our content view, you'll see that we have this delete function and we actually don't need this anymore because we now extract this out. So let's just delete this and this should complain and say, hey, I can't find delete, which it does here. So instead of doing that there, we're now just going to simply replace this with provider.delete like so. So now we're just using the function from within our provider. And then this is going to say within what context do we want to delete this in. And because we're on the main screen here, we can swipe across and delete an actual item. We actually want this to be our provider.viewContext, so the main view context that we're on, which is what we want. Cool. So now the next thing that we want to do is actually look at using this provider as well within our contact row view. So if we go into our contact row view, you'll see here that we have logic for like toggling and persisting that data here. So rather than us doing this mock has changes here, instead of us doing that, we're going to now pass in our provider like so. So I'm going to say let provider, and this is going to be our contact provider like so. And this should complain saying that it's missing that extra parameter. So that's fine. And just so we're on the same provider, I'm just going to create a new property here called preview. And then this is going to be ContactsProvider.shared. And then this preview that we pass in here, the context is going to be our preview provider.viewContext. And then it's going to be the same here where it's our preview provider preview provider like so. Cool. And now in our toggle favorite function, we don't need to do this anymore. Instead, we can just remove this and we can simply just call provider.persist in mock, which is the current context that this is in, using our environment value here. So we're actually using the environment values managed object context to make sure we save this on the main context within this view, which is what we want. And obviously this throws, so we need to make sure that this uses the try as well. Cool. So this should fail in our view, which is fine. So we just build this. And then here, we simply just need to insert our provider that we have at the top here. Cool, which is what we want. Sweet. So within our view model as well, on our edit view model, you'll see that we have code for checking to see if it exists or not. So again, we don't need all of this code here anymore. Instead, we can just remove this we can just do provider.exists in exists, and then what we want to check here is the contact, and then this is going to be context like so. Cool. So we replace that with in here, and then we also have a save here, and this is now our provider dot persist. So we can replace this. Okay, cool. So we also want to use our provider within this scope. Now we don't actually have a global property for that, so let's create one. So before our context, we're just going to say private let provider, and this is going to be contacts provider, and then we're just going to set it here and say self.provider like so. And then within our save, now what we can say is try provider.persist like so in, and then the in that we want to persist this in is the context that we assign here. So now we have that set up. So let's actually just build this and see what happens, and we should get a build succeeded. So just to make sure that this works fine, what we're going to do is actually just run this, and you should see that the data looks fine. I can actually favorite and unfavorite, and if I just run this again after favoriting someone, you can see it persists that. I can create a brand new contact, and it will add the brand new contact as well. And I can also update the contact as well. So I could change this to be, I don't know, person one, done, person one. And if I was to just rerun this, you'll see all of our changes are persisted. So this is now working good. And we've managed to actually isolate all of our code away. Now I'm just going to check one more time that I've actually done that. So if I go to my create view, yep. Okay. Cool. Yeah, this is looking good. Sweet. So yeah, this is looking all good, like what we want. Sweet. So now one thing I don't know if you realize this yet, but if you actually do this, this is valid. So you can actually create an empty person within Coordinator. Now I did mention before at the start, when you're creating your entities, that you could actually have regular expressions on properties, well, attributes, to make sure that you don't, they don't fail. But we're not going to do that in this video. I'm probably going to look at it in a future course. But in this tutorial, we're just going to add in some basic validation to make sure that you don't enter an empty person in. Now, quite simple to do this. All we need to do is go into our contact and essentially create another computer property called isValid to handle making sure that none of the properties that we care about are empty. So we don't need to worry about our date of birth and favorite, because by default, when you create them, they already have a value, which is great. But we want to make sure that when you create a brand new person, someone enters in a name, email, phone number at bare minimum. So that's what we care about. So on here, we're going to create a new computer property called isValid. And then we're just simply going to check to see if those properties are empty. That's it. So let's do that now. So now in our create view, we need to create some kind of state property for telling our view that an error has occurred if this is not valid. So we're going to create a state property here called has error, like so. And this is going to dictate showing the alert or not, which you guessed it. I have a video on my channel about alerts as well that you can check out. But we're also going to need to wrap our code in the logic. So this time, when you tap the done button, before we try to save that data, we're going to check to see if the contact is valid at all. So just to make this a bit cleaner, what we're going to do is actually create a new function. So we're going to say private extension, create contact view. And we're just going to create a function called, validate user, or validate, let's just call it validate, right? And then within here, we're going to say if contact So we're going to say if the view model dot contact is valid, then we're going to call the code that we have in our button right now, or else we're going to do the bad path and show you some kind of error. So we want to copy this code in here within the is valid bit, and within our else bit, we want to set our has error to true, like so. Cool. So now we can call this validate function within our button, like so. And all we need to do now is simply attach a alert to our view. So let's do that now. Okay, sweet. So now we have our alert, and we're simply just checking to see if this is true. And if it is, then we'll just show some text on the screen. So let's just test this out and see if it works. Okay, cool. So now we'll deal with this in a second. But if I was to actually tap on this and hit done now, you'll see that we actually get our alert telling us that something ain't right, which is what we expected. So I can't create an empty contact anymore. So what I'm going to do now is just simply swipe across here and then hit delete, and then I can now remove that. One thing I will say is that whilst I was actually testing this project out, and sometimes I realized that this would actually crash when you actually swipe across and delete an empty contact. Now, what you can do to basically kind of make it handle it a bit better is the line where we have the button to actually swipe across to delete. So our delete provider function, rather than this being the view context, we can actually replace this with a new context where we do the changes, and it will persist those changes. So it's away from the view context. So that way it's a tiny bit more safer when you want to modify and delete items. So what I'm going to do now is actually just test this out to be sure that we're still good. And let's just delete someone. And then if we just rerun this, we should only have 2 people. Okay, sweet. So you can see we have 2 people. So this should help out any kind of crashes that you maybe come across when you're modifying people. All right, cool. So now we've refactored that and we've got basic validation in place. The next thing we need to do now is I actually want to add in some kind of search bar to help me sort and filter users on the screen, so I can type in some names and see people in. So we can actually do this quite easily by using the searchable modifier available to us in SwiftUI. And I'm not even going to say it because you know I've got a video on it. So what we're going to do is this time on our Z stack, we're going to use the searchable modifier. So I need to, first of all, just add that on. So after here, we'll say dot searchable. And then we'll just set it to an empty constant for now. So we need this searchable modifier to basically bind to some kind of, basically string state property. So below our contact to edit, I'm going to create a new state property called query. Within this, we're going to create something that we can query. So we're going to create something called like a search config for our query. So I'm actually going to put this within a struct because I want to also be able to search and filter people out at the same time. So we'll go create a struct here called search config. And then this is going to have a property in it called query. And it's just going to be an empty string. Cool. So now we need to create an instance of this state property within our content view. So here, we're just going to say at state and then private var. And this is going to be our search config. And we're just going to initialize this with an empty one. We're just going to say dot in it for now. Cool. So we need to actually bind this search config to our searchable modifier. So here on our text, I'm going to replace this with search config.query. So now the query within our search bar is what you're going to, whenever you type something in, it's going to update this object. So just so you can see this without us having to run the app, I'm just going to open up the canvas. And we should see a navigation bar on the screen. Cool. So now you can see the search bar. So if you tap on it and you start typing, obviously nothing's going to happen because we're not doing any kind of filtering just yet. So we need to actually listen to changes to our search query. And we can do that by using the onChange modifier. So on our view, so after our sheet here, we're going to say dot on change of, and this is going to listen to changes to our search config. So here we're just going to say search config and then new value. So anytime this changes, this will fire as long as the value is new, so the new value. So this actually does require our struct to conform to the equatable protocol, which it doesn't right now. So we'll do that now by saying equatable like so, which is what we want. Okay, cool. And now we can list the changes to our search config, which is exactly what we want. So when you're actually working with SwiftUI, you actually do have this fetch request property wrapper, like I said before. But how can we like kind of trigger this to fire again? Because we want this to basically re-trigger with a new query. Well, what we need to do is first of all create a predicate for it, and then we can actually set a property to force it to refresh with the query that we want. So let's go into our contact, and we're going to create a new query below our all, and this is going to help us filter out a contact. So what we want to do here is create a new function, static func, and we're just going to call this filter, and in here you can pass in a query, and this will return to you a predicate. So an NS predicate is essentially a way of you writing a statement to fetch some data. So if you've ever worked with SQL before, this is literally a SQL statement. So it's a statement for you to get data from CoreData and display that to your UI. So we need to basically create a predicate that essentially says, get me back any of the contacts where their name contains this query string. So we'll create that now. So in order to do that, we need to create a NS predicate. And we can use this option here with the format and the arguments. So in our case, the format is going to be name contains. And then we're going to use this here, CD. So this just basically makes sure it checks for any cases. So either upper or lower case, basically any text that matches this string, regardless of the case, just give it to me. And then we're going to need to use the %sign and the @ symbol. So this %size @ symbol is the placeholder for where our query will be stubbed into, which is why we have args, as you can see here. So for our args here, we're going to put in here our query. So this predicate would help us filter out any person where their name, regardless of the case, matches our query. So this is pretty cool. So if you actually want to learn more about these predicates and see how to actually type them out for other use cases, then check out the Apple documentation, because they have examples in plain English of, you know, how you write it. So we've got this in place for a query, but what about if our query is empty? We actually don't want to, you know, filter anything out. We just want to show everything. In order to do that, we need to use a predicate where the return value is true. So we're first of all going to say query dot is empty, and if it is empty, we're going to say NS predicate, and we're going to set the value to true to help us return everything. Now, if it is empty, then we're going to return everything, or else we're going to use our predicate where we filter out any names that contain this query string. So now we need to use this function within our onChange modifier. So all we need to do is, if you go into our content view again, on our ContactsProvider.swift, there's a property called NS predicate, and this property, when it's set, basically re-triggers and executes the predicate to display onto the screen. So we're going to say NS predicate is equal to contact.filter, and then this is going to be our new value.query. Cool. So let's actually just test this out. So now, if I was to go in here and type out 0, you can now see it only shows the 0 item. And if I was to type out 1, it only shows 1. So we're able to actually now filter out our data. And when I empty the, search screen, you can see that it displays everything. So we're now handling filtering our data. So one more thing that I do want to do here is that we actually do have favorites and non-favorites. What about if I want to separate out the favorites and only show them on the screen, that people that basically are proper true ride or dies, or I just want to show everyone? Well, we can actually add a option into the top left hand corner with a menu to allow you to basically switch between and filter between different types of people. So let's just add that in now. So first of all, what we're going to do is on our struct, we're now going to create a enum called filter. And it's going to have two cases. It's going to have a case, all, and fav. So you can have either all or favorites. And then we're going to add a new property in here called filter, which you guessed it, of type filter. And by default, this will be all because we want to show everyone. So we're going to need to update our filter function here on our contact. We're going to have a new parameter here called type. And this is going to be of type search config dot filter. Cool. So what we have here at this moment in time is we're only filtering out people based on the query value in a string. So what we actually need to do here instead is we now need to also take into account that we might also want to filter out and search for people that are only favorites or people that are all. So we're actually going to need to change our logic here a bit. So we're going to say here, we're going to use a switch statement and we're going to say type. So if the type is all, then we're going to use what we have now because we don't want to specifically find people that are only favorites. But if, and then we need to return this, cool. But now what we want to do is in our favorite, we're just going to say return and we're going to write the same query. But this time we want to use a AND operator. So we want to also check to see that someone is a favorite. So we're going to say and then we're going to use our is favorite attribute on our, contact. And we're going to check to see if it's equal to true, like so. Now, because arguments is a variadic parameter, so you can just basically pass in as many, arguments as you want, we can now say here, NS number value true. Cool. So when you're working, let's put this on a new line. Cool. So when you're actually working with core data and you want to do true or false, if you want to basically check to see if something's true or false, you can use NS number value true and that will convert true to either 1 or 0 for you. So this is our statement here now. So we're checking to see the query that we said before and we're checking to see if the favorite is equal to the argument that we have here, which is 1 true. Cool. So one thing I clocked here is that rather than us actually, having two separate parameters, instead, what we could just do is just pass in an entire, the entire search config. So we're just going to say filter with config. And then this is just going to be of type search config. And now we can just directly use the parameters within this struct within here, which is probably much better. So we're going to say config.type here. And then config.query here, and again config.query here as well. And we're just going to replace it wherever it's needed, like so. Okay, cool. Sweet. So now, back in our content view, we don't actually need this anymore. We can just say new, just so it's clear, we'll just say new config. I'm just passing our new config like so. Cool. And then we're going to need to replace this with our filter. Cool. So now we have our config.filter, and then we just replace our queries beforehand and just put config before them so we can access that property for our query string. And now within our filter, we've changed this to new config. And we need to add in the with. So we've got our new config and we're also passing that into this function. So it's exactly what we want. Cool. The only thing that we don't have here just yet is essentially a menu. So we need to add a menu into our toolbar on the right hand side. So what I want to do is actually move this plus button to the left hand side this time. So in our toolbar, we'll change the placement of this to be trailing. Well, not trailing, leading, navigation bar leading, and that should put it on the left, which is what we want. So now on the right hand side, we can now put our menu there. So let's just do this now. So we're going to create a new toolbar placement. And we're going to need the placement to be trailing and the content within it. So the content within this is going to be a menu, and we want this to have a content and a label like so. Now the content we'll get onto in a second, but the label that we want in here is to be an ellipses for this menu. So we're going to put in an ellipses using an SS symbol like so. Okay, cool. And now within here for our menu, we actually want this to be a section. So we're going to put a section in here with a title of filter. And then within here, we essentially want this to basically have a picker, because we want to allow the user to select two options and a picker gets rendered with that within a menu. So what's going to bind to here is going to be our search config query, well, search config.filter, and then the content in here. So for our label, the text is going to be we'll just say filter favorites. This won't actually render on the screen because of the OS that we're using. But within our picker, we're just going to have two texts. So I'm going to have one text that says all. And because we're working within a picker, we need to set a tag. So the tag here is going to be search config dot filter dot all. And then the next tag is going to be fave, so that our picker can uniquely identify which one has been selected and then update our config in our state property. So this one, we want to rename this to favorites like so. Cool. And then now in our SwiftUI preview, we should see our menu on our left hand side. Cool. So now you see the ellipses. So now if I tap on this, you'll now see that we get two. So now if we just run this, you'll now see these two options. And if I tap on favorites, so if I now tap on favorites, you'll see that nothing is happening. But pause. If we tap on favorites, nothing is happening. And to be honest with you, there's actually two problems that I've got here. So the first problem I've got is that I actually want to have some kind of title here, which I'm not seeing. So what I need to do is I need to take this out, I think, and then just put my own text here within the section to render this out. So we're going to say filter. And let's see if it just displays now. SwiftUI preview is taking a while. So I'm just going to run this on the simulator. And now I can see my header here, filter. So that's what I want. So I wanted my separator filter. So there, we've now got our filter options separated here like so. And the next thing is that when I tap on favorites, nothing is happening. And I think my query in my contacts is wrong. So let's look at this here. So what we're saying here is, okay, cool. So this is why it's wrong. So what we want to do here is in our favorites here, we actually don't want to return everything if our search query is empty. Instead, we actually want to use a query to only return our favorite people. So we're going to replace that with this. And then we're not going to search for a name where it's empty. We're just going to take this out. And we're just going to only return people where their favorite is true if the query is empty. So that's the mistake. So let's just go over this one more time because I know it might be a bit confusing. So we'll go check our filter. And then if the case is all people, then we're going to check to see if it's empty. If it is empty, then we're going to return everyone. If it isn't empty, we're going to try and find someone where their name contains that query. But if you tap on favorites and the query is empty, we're going to return everyone that is favorited, so true. Or else if there's a query, we're going to return everyone where their name matches that query and they are a favorite. So, 4 different conditions here. So if you need to take time to break this down and rewatch that bit again, it's all right because, it's 4 different statements. So now let's actually test that out again this time. So in the SwiftUI previews, let's just filter these out. Favorites, and now you can see that it only shows our favorites on the screen, which is what we want. If we go to all, it does that. If I go to favorites and I search for free, it only shows me the third person. If I clear that, I now get that, and that is a nasty SwiftUI bug. So yeah, that's not a great SwiftUI bug, is it? So let's just get off that. Cool. So let's just run that on the simulator where it's probably not as buggy. and we're just going to favorite. And I'm actually going to create a new person. So we'll say all. I'm going to create a new person where they are a favorite as well. So we'll just get a few favorites in here. Okay, cool. So now we'll switch to favorite here. We'll do F, and I only get by F. If I hit cancel, I now go back to my list of favorites. If I go to all, I now see everyone here. So this is exactly what I want. So this is exactly how it should be working. Cool, sweet. So now what we want to be doing is we want to also in our menu allow people to sort either in ascending or descending order. So now we'll go look at how we can handle sorting in Coordinator within SwiftUI. So first of all, we're going to need to create a new enum, and we're just going to call this sort. And it's going to have two cases, so ascending and descending. Cool. And then we're going to need to create a new property away from the search config. Now, when you're trying to do filtering and sorting, you don't want to do them both within the same onChange modifier because you can get some weird side effects. So instead, you want to make sure that you're actually separating it out. So what we're going to do now is here on our search config, we're going to, well, underneath it, we're going to create a new state private var called sort. And then by default, this is just going to be ascending by default because that's what our initial all query is. And if we just scroll down, what we're going to need to do now is within our below our onChange, we're going to need to do a new onChange of sort. And then this is going to be our new sort. So within here, what we need to do is that on our contact, we need to create a new function to help us sort our people. So we're going to need to create a new function within it to help us return a sort descriptor. So let's go into our contact, and then similar to our filter function, we want to have another function called sort. And then we're just going to say order, and it's just going to be sort, and it's simply just going to return a NS sort descriptor like so. Cool. So essentially, it's going to be an array of NS sort descriptors. So essentially, what we want to do here is simply just reuse our code from here in our all, and this time just return an array. So we're going to say array sort descriptors, and the ascending true is going to be order is equal to ascending. So if that's equal to ascending, then it should be true. If it's descending, it will be false. So we need to use this within the onChange on our content view. So let's go back to our content view, and then within here, we're simply just going to say contacts dot sort. So we need our NS sort descriptors. So not sort descriptors, NS sort descriptors, contact dot sort. And then the order is going to be a new sort. That's it. Cool. So we don't actually have anything to change the sort now because we don't have a menu. So let's add in another section here. So we're just going to copy this section. And this time we're going to create a header here called sort, like so. And then this is now going to be bound to sort rather than sort description, like so. And then what we want to do in here is we want to have a label which is ascending and descending. So I'm going to add this in and we'll break it down. So now we have a section where sort, and we can sort by ascending or descending, and we show an arrow depending on which direction you want to sort in. And now we tag it as well with our sort. So whenever this changes, it will update our state value, and that will then trigger our onChange, which will then refresh our list. So we need to test this out to see if this works. So let's just see what happens. So you can see here by default, it's ascending. And if we change this to descending, it reverses the list. So this is working fine. And I can actually combine these now as well. So I can actually say favorites, and it's now, showing the favorites in descending order. And I can now go to ascending, and it's showing me my favorites in ascending order. So we've got, quite a lot of filtering and sorting in place with minimal code just by literally modifying that property wrapper. This is why SwiftUI with Coordinator can be easy if you know how to use what you've got available to you. So now we've built all our UI and we've got all our features in place. The final thing I want to wrap up on is unit testing. So what you can do if you want to validate that your models are being created and are being set properly is just write some unit tests. Now, in my opinion, when you're working with core data and you're doing CRUD operations, it makes more sense to write UI tests. Now, the reason why I say that is because you want to validate that what you see on the screen is correct. And I do have videos on UI testing, but for this model, when we're working with our contacts, so just making sure that everything is set properly and our queries are all right, unit testing makes sense. But for making sure that the UI is correct, I would go with a UI test. They can be slower, but it just makes a bit more sense in my opinion. So what we're going to do now is actually just create a unit test for our contacts model. So let's do that now. So the first thing we're going to do, we need to make sure that the contact provider that we have is only being, used in memory as well if it's a SwiftUI preview or if it is a unit test. So I'm just going to copy in some code and then I'll just break it down. Okay, cool. So essentially what this extension does, and I'll be honest again, I've nabbed this from Stack Overflow, but what this allows you to do is it literally allows you to test to see if you're running a unit test essentially. So now we can check to see if a test is running. So we're going to say here, if it's a preview or the thread, damn, I can't type, or the thread is running. Did I not make that static? No, I didn't. So we'll make this static. So is running XC test like so. Okay, cool. So now we're checking to see if it's a preview or if it's running an XC test, right? So now what we're able to do is actually just test our model in isolation. So the first thing we're going to need to do to actually write unit tests is create a unit testing bundle. Now there's two ways of doing this. You can either go to your targets and hit plus on the bottom here and create it from there, or you can go to file, new, and then target and create it from there as well. So in here, if you type out unit test, you'll see a unit testing bundle, which is what we want. I hit next. And then I'm just going to leave this by the defaults as the tests, and it will generate a folder here with some default files, which is what we want. Cool. So I'm going to create a brand new test file. So we'll create a new file and just type out test in here. We want a unit test case class. And I'm going to just call this model tests. I'm just going to create it within our test folder on our test target. And we can delete this file that gets automatically generated for us. Cool. So within this model test file, I'm just going to type out a few use cases and just break down the purpose of each one. So I'm going to do that and then we'll come back to it. So now I've added in our use cases. So let's just break down each one. So we've got a test here to make sure that our contact is empty when we create an empty contact. We also want one for also making sure that our contact is not valid and our contact is valid when we do validation, as well as checking to see if their birthday is valid, and also to test as well if the previews function where we create contacts for previews are valid as well. And we have some tests for our filters to make sure our queries are all correct as well. So these are things that we're just going to be testing on our model to make sure that it's all good. So if we ever come around and make a change because, we want to, change something and we need to make sure our queries or whatever is all okay, these tests will fail if we violate those conditions. So it's just a safety check. So the first thing we're going to need to do in here is actually import our module into this here. So we're going to need to say at testable import. And the module that we're going to import here is the target within our project. So the target name is going to be this here. So it needs to be spelled exactly like your target here. Now mine is called my ride or dies. So import my ride or dies like so. Cool. And we're also going to set up our provider that we're going to be working with. So we're going to say private var provider. And this is going to be contacts provider. And then we're going to use our setup function like so. And we also need a tear down as well, like so. Cool. So within our setup, we're going to use our provider.shared, and in our teardown, we're going to set it back to nil. So every time we run a new test, it will always be a fresh new provider in memory, which is what we want. So let's first of all work on testing that our contact is empty. So in order to do this, we first of all want to say let and then contact, and then we just simply want to say contact dot empty. And then the context that we want to specifically pass in is our provider.viewContext, because we want to use the one within our test. So in here, we want to check to see if all of our properties are empty, so our string properties, and we want to make sure our date is today and our isFavorite is also false by default. So let's do that now. So you can see here, I'm just making sure that these are equal to empty strings, and our favorite is false. So we're asserting that it's false, and we're also making sure that it's within today's date. So it's true, because when we make an empty contact, we create it for today now. So if we run this test and see what happens, so you'll see that we get a failure, and that's because actually, you know what? So this function doesn't need to be static. And then this should be thread dot current is running XC test. So this needs to be thread dot current is running XC test, and this function shouldn't be static. So let's go back into our test and just try that again. Cool. And now you should see that our test passed for whether our contact is empty or not. So now we're validating to make sure that they're not empty. So next we want to do here is actually test to see if the contact is not valid. So we're going to do a similar thing here where we create a empty contact and make sure that the is valid returns true. So we're just going to copy this. And then we're going to do an XCT assert true. And then we're just going to say contact.isValid. Like so. Cool. Okay. So now let's just run this test. Oh, mate, that's wrong. So this should actually be assert true, but it does show that it's working. This should actually be assert false because they're not valid. So we actually want this to be XCT assert false. So you can see I've been recording this video for too long. So this time, let's just run this. And that's correct because they're not valid because they're empty. Okay, cool. So now we want to check to see if a contact is valid. So that means that all their information, so their email, phone number, and their name has been filled out. So we're going to use our contact.preview. And then the context is going to be, again, the provider.viewContext. And then XCT assert true. And then contact.isValid again. So this time this should be true because we create a contact with information filled in for the preview. So let's just run this. Cool. And then we're going to do a same thing here where we're going to check to see if it's their birthday. So I'm going to copy this. Because when you create a preview contact, it actually gets the first one and it doesn't add zero. It adds zero onto the day. So the first contact, their birthday is always today. So we're going to say is birthday, like so. And then we'll run this. Cool. And now you can see that this passes as well. So this is all good. So just to make sure that this definitely works, what we actually could do as well is we could check to see if it's not their birthday. And we could do this where we make two. So we'll say contact is not, birthday is not valid. And we can say contact.make preview. And then the count will be 2. And it will be provider.viewContext. Like so. And then we'd want to get the last one. So we want to be contact.last. And then if we build this, this should be assert false. So now if we just run this test, should complain. So we can use, so we can say here XCT unwrap to unwrap the value. Throws. Cool. Right. So we're saying here that the function should throw, and we're going to try to unwrap this value and get the last contact, and then check to see if it's their birthday. So this should be false because the last contact is their birthday would actually be yesterday. Cool. And that passes as well. So now we're making sure that the birthday is valid in both scenarios. So we want to check to see if the preview that we create is valid. So essentially when we create a array of contacts and we loop through each contact, is the data correct? So I'm just going to test 5 contacts. So we're going to say in here count, and we're going to create a count of 5. And then we're simply just going to create some contacts here. So we're going to copy our make from before here, put that in here, and then replace the count here with this count. Cool. So we'll go call this contacts. Cool. So we're going to now loop through our contacts and essentially match to see if the first item is like item 0 and then item 1 and then so on and so forth. So I'm going to type this out and then we'll break it down. Cool. So what we're saying here is that we're going to loop through the contacts count, get the item, and then validate that the name matches what we expect essentially. So if it's item space and then 0, if it's test underscore 0 email, the phone number, you know, we're also comparing the date as well, because this is the logic that we have for the date when we create a contact, and also as well if the notes is the same. So let's just run this test and see what happens. And you can see that this test also passes as well. So our tests are all passing here now. So this is all good to go as well. Cool. So now after we finish doing this test to see if a preview is valid with the data that we provided in our, make previews function, what I want to do now is actually write some tests for making sure that our filter and our sort queries are actually valid as well. In here, what we're actually going to be testing is the string representation of the predicate to make sure that this matches what we expect. So the first one we want to do is we want to create our request. And because we're testing to see the request to only get our favorites on the screen, we're going to say contact dot filter with, and then in our init here, the query, the filter is going to be fave, like so. Okay, cool. So now we're only getting back our contacts that are favorites. So in here, we want to do an XCT assert equal, and we want to make sure that this representation matches this string I'm about to put in here now. Cool. So in here, we want request.predicate format. So this is going to check to see if the predicate format matches this string, and if it does, then that means it's good. So let's say in the future, if you ever come across, you go and make a change and your predicate changes, this test will actually fail, and it'll basically be an indication that something's changed and your query might be wrong, or it might be right. But essentially this is just telling you that that predicate has now changed. So let's just test this out and see if it runs and passes. Cool. And now that passes. So the next thing we need to do is we need to do the same, but this time for our all. So we're going to copy this, and we're going to specify here all. Now for our all, we just basically use a true predicate here, like so. So what we need to do is we need to check to see if it's a true predicate. So I can do this by just removing this and just using true predicate, like so. Cool. And now let's just run this and see if this works. Cool. And now that passes. So the next one we have here is to filter all query. So this is a query, but we're now getting all contacts that are just anyone. So we just want to get all of them that match a specific filter query. So we're going to need to create a new request again and contact.filter with, and this time we want an init where we have a query string. So we're just going to create actually a constant here called query. And in here, let's go write tons. And for the query, tons, like so. Cool. So now we want to assert, do an XCT assert equal, and then we're going to do here, it's going to be the name contains CD. This is going to need to use some string escaping. So they're going to need to use some, this is going to need to use some, like, you know, quotes within a string. So we're going to use some forward slashes here. So we're going to do forward slash and then quotation mark. And then we want to do another forward slash this time, but use string interpolation here. And then in here, we're going to say query. And then we're also going to need to use another forward slash and then another quotation at the end here. So we're going to wrap our query in quotation marks because that's what the predicate does when you have an argument. It swaps it in with a query string. So in here, we want to match this to our request.predicate format like so. Cool. So now let's just run this and see what happens. And now you'll see that our test passes. So this is exactly what we want. And now we have our final one here, which is the same as the other one, except this time we set our filter to be favorite and have a query. So I'm just literally going to copy this, paste. And then for our filter, we're going to set this to be fave. And then we're going to have a and is favorite is equal to 1, similar to what we have here. So if we just run this, you'll see that the test passes. So now we have tests to ensure that our model is all good when we're working with Coordinator. Now, one thing I am curious to see is the code coverage. So with code coverage, essentially what that is, if you don't know what it is it just lets you see how much of your code is actually tested. Now to see that, we have to go into our scheme, edit it, go onto our test option here, options, and then gather code coverage for all targets and then close. Cool. So now if we run our test, and we can do that from here or by doing it in our class or hitting Command U on your keyboard. I'm just going to run it. If you go to your reports here, you should now see an option here called coverage. So this will tell us how much of our code is actually tested. So if I just go onto coverage, it tells me that 65% of our code is, has code coverage, which in my opinion is pretty impressive. So to be honest with you, anything higher than 60 or 70% in my opinion is all right. Like 100% is a bit mad, but this is all right for this simple example. So you'll see here that we have 100% on our, so this is our main app entry point, which is fine, but on our contact, we have 93.7%. So that's pretty good. So most of our model is unit tested. The only thing that's not unit tested here is our sort descriptors, which to be honest with you, we could write a test for this, but I think it's fine in my opinion. So I'm gonna leave it. So yeah, so as you can see, we've actually covered a whole bunch of stuff now. So we have a full-on functioning app here with, sorting, and we can create new contacts. We got basic validation. So I'm just going to create some random person again. We've got a whole lot of information here in SwiftUI, and Coordinator with SwiftUI is really nice in my opinion. Like when I was learning, just playing around with this kind of stuff, I found it a breeze to basically integrate this into this app quite easily. And obviously, like I said before, the code coverage is pretty decent. So I'm gonna treat myself to a McDonald's. So that was everything in this video. If you enjoy my teaching style, I actually do have courses that you can actually check out. I'll actually put it on the screen here, but they're available on my website for you to check out as well. I also as well have a YouTube membership if you want to support me as well. So you can join the YouTube membership. So join the gang, you get some nice stickers and badges and whatnot. And I'd really appreciate it if you did that, because I can basically help continue doing what I'm doing, which is helping you learn, iOS development. Now, if you don't want to, contribute in a monetary value, that's fine. I understand. But what you can do to help me out for free is like the video, share, comment. Also as well, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bells to get updates for whenever I release a new video. So that's everything from me. I hope you enjoyed this, free course. And if you did enjoy it, I'd love to hear your feedback in the comment section below. That's everything from me. I'll catch you on a bit. Deuces.